Well, thank you very much for inviting me, and I'm looking also to a very good session, especially because some of the discussions I had interactions with already before. Daniel Koster, actually an old friend, or a friend and an old colleague. With Matthew, we had also wonderful discussions in Italy, and I'm looking forward to also interact with Dominica. My presentation is mainly on the second part of the topic on the financial and fiscal responses to the global and financial crisis. If I can have the next slide, please. Next slide, please. Next slide.
I think it's yours, so if you go forward. No, it's ours.
It's yours.
No, it's your screen, so you have to go next.
Is it? No. It's yours. I have now on my screen the second is open.
One moment.
Yeah, okay, that's okay. Yes, okay.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So every time you will say next screen, please, but not now. There was an exercise. So what I want to discuss is that the global and economic crisis provoked by COVID disproportionately hurt low-income workers in developing countries through increasing poverty, food insecurity, and income inequality. And as we just heard from Leon, that's not only of COVID, but on top of that is now the disastrous consequences of the brutal aggression of Russia in Ukraine. But if we look how in a global level there was a reaction, we could see that we could see that richer nations cushioned their economies from the worst impacts with unprecedented massive and fiscal and financial support programs. But we discussed that at the last three things, so I don't need to go into that further. But these were, however, unequally distributed and failed in many cases to cushion the negative effects on low-income workers, leading to greater inequality. And I think Daniel is going to talk more about that. But the developing countries lacked such capacity and received feeble multilateral contingency financing, symptomizing the fundamental flaws in the international financial and fiscal system. And of course, a weak international financial system is not only to the detriment of developing countries, but also to developed countries. For one reason, if developing countries go into recession or even worse, the markets will be restrained, and the developed countries, richer countries, cannot profit from the markets in these countries. And so there's a whole interactive process also behind the malfunctioning of the international financial and fiscal system. Next slide, please. Yeah, so this slide indicates it's from ILO analysis that the global COVID pandemic has reinforced and aggravated inequalities. And ILO statistics actually indicate vulnerable groups: female domestic workers, gig economy workers, home-based workers, street vendors, migrant workers, and low-wage workers. And also the reason why they are much more affected: limited savings, lack of social protection, limited employment rights, major income and job losses. So impoverishment and insecurity has deepened among the most disadvantaged groups, both in industrialized and in developing countries. Next slide, please. Here you see how the COVID GDP losses have reacted, and you see that developing countries were much more affected, not directly by COVID, but by these interactions in the financial and fiscal system, and also by the trade system. Next slide, please. In the reaction to the crisis, there's a difference in the decomposition in terms of unemployment, inactivity, and reduced working hours. In developing countries, we have seen more reduced working hours and inactivity, not so much unemployment, because poor people cannot afford to be unemployed because they just don't have any unemployment benefits. So we see also that there distinction is, and that is well reflected in the indexes. Next slide, please. What is important, and especially also for the position of the trade union, is that the lower skilled workers were much more affected than medium and high skilled workers. This are also from figures from the ILO and from our article, which has been distributed before. You see the changes in employment and in activity is much greater for low skilled workers than for high skilled workers, and some high skilled workers actually didn't have hardly any effect. So that is creating, and we see that also politically, a big backlash of low-income workers against the current government and the current government systems, because they feel rightly so that they have been at the wrong end of the stick during this crisis and also in the coming crisis. Next slide, please. As we go to the poverty, which is also a major indicator at the moment, and we see that in many countries, is if you read many of the major poverty studies and indicated poverty figures for how many people have, how much poverty has increased, most of the studies assume that the crisis had no impact on within-country income distribution, and consequently also that workers across sectors and type of activity were affected all at the same degree. Now, in the previous slide, I showed already that's not the case. So it's important, and research is going on, not many institutions are working on that, to very much include the within country inequality, SDG 10. Next slide, please. And a special effect is on the patterns of food consumption. That's more explained in our article. Lynn mentioned that already, that not only because of COVID and but my colleagues in FPRI in Washington, one of the co-authors of my article, found that there were the recession and supply disruptions already COVID caused by pandemic are resulted in substantial changes in food consumption with adverse nutritional consequences. And this will induce, as they found, shift demand from nutrient-dense foods, such as fruit and vegetables, towards calorie-rich basic staple foods. So the health situation is also deteriorating. And this was during COVID and also in the aftermath of COVID, and of course also now much more aggravated by the war in Ukraine. And also we see those patterns in changing to bad diets in both developed and developing regions. Next slide, please. Now I come to the substance of my intervention, and I repeat what the United Nations Secretary General said recently in the most recent report on precarity. There is no answer to the cost of living crisis without an answer to the finance crisis, and on that I will now concentrate more in depth. Next slide, please. The global economic crisis provoked by the COVID-19 pandemic has painfully revealed the fundamental flaws in the international and fiscal system. You could see that while advanced countries could engage in massive fiscal and monetary support measures, which were really massive, thanks also to push from the EU and, dare I say it, also of the IMF, which is not always a usual player in this field. Countries that did a lot of deficit financing. During the first year of the pandemic, advanced countries provided fiscal stimuli to the tune of 12.5% of GDP on average. That's unheard of. And so it shows if there is political will and there's an urgency, then countries can act, but they don't act always. And we'll see also what is happening today in case of the war in Ukraine and the reactions now from financial institutions. This massive support was 3 times more in relative terms than the stimulus in emerging and middle-income countries, and almost 10 times more than governments in low-income countries could provide. So actually, the international financial fiscal system was very much biased to the rich countries who could had the means to do deficit financing, but the poor countries could do it, and the fiscal system didn't give the space for them to do that. And so this divergence in government support actually mimicked the inequality of the vaccine rollout. If you remember, it took a long time before the vaccine reached the poor countries in the world. Next slide, please. Here you see more in picture what I mentioned in the slide before, and you see how little, especially the low-income countries, the poor income countries, could give fiscal and monetary support during the COVID crisis and the economic recession following that. And I think if you really look at the figures in general, it's shameful actually. Next slide, please. So we have a non-functioning international financial system. Lacking sufficient domestic resources to support economies to pay for health costs and stimulate their economies in developing countries, they needed to look for other outside resources. They couldn't do them themselves. And this proved very difficult for many developing countries for several reasons. Next slide, please. After a period of external debt levels supported by the highly indebted poor country initiative during the 2000s, the first decade in the 2000s, external debt burdens of many low-income countries surged again during the 2010 after the crisis. But what also happened, developing countries faced an outflow of capital to developed countries. And normally, if a world financial system is working properly, capital should flow from rich countries to poor countries. But what is now happening, and you see that also in the newspaper articles, developing countries face an outflow of capital, and they're also hit, and even more now than last year, by the appreciation of the dollar. And that means their own currency is depreciated. And most of the debt of these countries are in dollars, so they are in huge problem. And you have all following the discussions now of various countries getting into severe debt problems. The other thing was that still, despite the emergency of the situation, additional resources made available came with conditions that in fact made these less effective as a response to the impacts of the pandemic. Pandemic, you need quick to burst money without many conditions, and again the system didn't allow for that. There were programs by the World Bank and the IMF, and in certain countries it worked, but in most countries it was still difficult to disburse very quickly money. Next slide, please. So in our article we make 4 proposals to make the international financial system fit for purpose, to achieve the SDGs and to combating the outfall of the COVID-19 pandemic. First issue is an equitable international tax coordination mechanism. A second one is a multilateral backed sovereign debt workout mechanism. The third one is overhauling policy conditionalities associated with development finance. And fourthly, increasing the special drawing rights, and with an emphasis to be leveraged for development finance. Doesn't make any sense if the internet special drawing rights, this is actually the created money by the IMF, if that mainly used for the industrialized countries. And in the last part of my presentation, I will explain a bit more those 4 proposals. So if I can have the next slide. So the first one is to establish a credible mechanism for international tax coordination. These mechanisms would include an internationally agreed uniform corporate tax of approximately 25% to stop tax base erosion in developing countries. This tax rate would hinder multinational companies shifting their profits to tax haven. And also improved tax coordination should further include mandated publication of data on offshore wealth holdings. This would enable jurisdictions to adopt effective progressive wealth taxes and facilitate the monitoring of income taxes paid by super wealthy. We had earlier already discussions on the statistics in the EU, and I think these statistics on wealth distribution are very important because inequality in wealth is increasing. So the more information is available, the better people, political parties, trade unions can react to that. Now, there is a pressure for it, and G20 indeed agreed to a proposal for uniform corporate tax treatment in 2021. But at 15%, the rate is still significantly lower than proposed, and thereby falling short of making more significant impact on boosting tax revenues and on limiting profit shifting behavior. And NGOs and concerned citizens are still pushing for a higher tax rate. 15% on corporate tax is very low. It used to be much higher. Next slide, please. Let's give the discussion on the multilateral-backed sovereign debt workout mechanism. Existing mechanism to renegotiate sovereign debt with private creditors have improved over the years, but they're still far from adequate. And this is due to the multiplicity of debt contracts, some of which are not subject to collective action clauses. That means that if one group agrees to debt reductions, the other does not, and does profit from the fact that some other groups allow for debt reduction. And that's why you need collective action clauses, that all groups who have lent money to countries apply the same measure of debt distribution. These collective action clauses are perceived as preventing more drastic action in cases of crisis. Without them, bonds could potentially lose a great amount of their value, and we have seen that at the moment with a number of countries. Sri Lanka, for example, is an example, caused by also bad management, but also by the fact that it's difficult to apply those collective action clauses. And so we should, like in national situation, a global institution to negotiate sovereign debts. That should be in place as soon as possible. There have been proposals for that since 15 years already. It's very difficult for countries to give juridical power to a body which is above the country level. It's a very, but in this globalized world, it's necessary to do and to have at an international level the same type of instruments we have also at the national level. And as a consequence, sovereign debt solvency problems continue to be solved in an ad hoc fashion at little favorable terms for debt distressed countries. And they still are accompanied by policy conditionalities, and that leads to a necessary hardship in the affected countries. Next slide, please. Reform of the policy conditionality attached to the International Monetary Fund contingency financing. I discussed that already earlier. I just repeat, when the IMF recognized the need for enhanced public spending by developing countries, it continues to provide pro-cyclical policy advice. That's to say, when countries receive money in that situation, they have to lower the debt ratio, and so it actually sometimes lengthened the crisis than shortened this. The means that IMF asked for fiscal restraints rather than deficit spending when the economies are in recession. I just explained that already. Next slide, please. And an important point is the more truly international liquidity by increasing special drawing rights and making these available to developing countries. And an important step in this direction, the IMF approved the issuance of $650 billion in new SDRs in June 2021. However, there's no agreement yet been reached regarding how these additional SDRs should be allocated to developing countries and how they can leverage additional investment to foster sustainable development. Because if developing countries and countries who need it most get more SDRs, are actually given a disproportionate number of the SDRs, they can kickstart the economy better. And had such reforms been in place already, the pandemic response would have been provided a fair level of playing field for emerging and developing countries. And this would have mitigated the pandemic worst economic consequences, and would also have been better for growth at a global level. Next slide, please. So what are the takeaways? All of these measures, reform measures amended, should not be seen as an act of charity or development aid. They are necessary to facilitate a global economic recovery that is both sustainable and equitable. As in the past, government leaders have acted with a me-first attitude, as has been blatantly clear in the rollout of vaccination programs, but also in their attitude to the international financial system. Some countries perceive this as a return to protectionism, and the form of protectionism was evident in the unprecedented fiscal response in high-income countries to protect livelihoods of their own citizens, but woefully disregarded the face of people in low-income countries. The government of those countries did not have the means to protect livelihoods of their citizens. However, we have seen that also in the past, and it's been argued by top economists, beggar thy neighbor policy responses will affect global prosperity in the long term. And now, especially in the war situation in Ukraine, that is sadly true, and will make achieving the Sustainable Development Goals in 2030 elusive. Thank you very much.